All right, boys, this is take two. Let's take another shot at it. Victor, how you doing?
Got it.
We replaced the Latin X chair.
Oh my God, I feel so colonized right now. You Canadians with your minds and your like colonization costumes. Oh my God.
Yeah, the chair cultural policy decision.
What's mine is mine. Now we're surrounding TV land, and I love America right now. America fucking rules right now. It shows where the rest of us are headed. But this has been quite a week.
Yeah, it has.
Oh, I've honestly.
And World War III is about to start, so a good time to be alive.
We're doing Marxist post-humanism as an argument, basically, today and last week. But then there's the whole thing that we're missing that we might have to return to, which is the technological post-humanism, because we're living in Trump's mind, which is also a primetime television show. So we're all on the set of his mind at this point.
I mean, he's about to enter the stage. It's like his show has been renewed for another season.
And also, it's not good TV, right? If it were good TV, like a film or like prestige TV, then you have the malevolent machine takeover. But this is just like the stupid machine takeover, and we're in a, what do you call it? Like a daytime TV or like reality TV, like the lowest quality of TV with Dr. Oz and the wrestling CEO's wife. Now they are the government. So it's the lowest quality genre of entertainment that is also now reality.
Trump is like a Neo born out of the matrix of the Twitter algorithm. And it's insane because at the same time, he's cause and product of a movement that is too large for us to understand. And I think like we're trying to make reverse engineering conclusions out of these events that are emerging out of this bubbling cesspool of spectacle. And like we're trying to understand how the world is moving below this bubbling cesspool. And it's insane, no? Like you say, the tectonic plates are coming into order to respond to a titan that is like emerging to come and destroy Olympus again. It's weird because at the same time, I think Trump it's a symptom, but it's not a cause of anything.
I think you're right to call it an effect. Like this will lead into the discussion because there's the ideology,
base and superstructure,
cause and effect. But Trump, in terms of organizing the country around the things that he's seen on TV in the morning, like Dr. Oz, it's daytime TV. I think this is why he likes going to rallies, because it's like a laugh track in real life. People laugh at his jokes in real life. And why he hates doing actual work, because there's no one to see him doing work. But he's like both the parasite of America and the host of America. They're in a, what do you call that when
symbiotic.
They're in a symbiotic relationship with each other, where you can't tell which is the parasite and which is the host, which I love. This is, if critical theory is for anything, it should be able to figure this out.
Yeah. I agree. I love your takes on like pop events. I think like analyzing pop events is just so wonderful. Like the Trump's participation in Aiden's Ross stream switch live with the Cybertruck wrapped into an America picture of Trump being shot. That was fucking sublime. It was so beautiful. Like we should talk more about those events. Those events are the ones people really care about.
I'd say Pills is good at that.
Reality is very simple, but it's quite boring. It's just stagnant wages for 30 years. That's why everything is this way. But that doesn't explain the fun shit.
Yeah, it's the stories we tell ourselves to justify the current relationships of power, which are fun. It's like how we like incrementally make stories crazier and crazier to justify the deregulation of markets. That's what's completely insanity to me.
Okay, I promised the listeners that we were going to actually read today because we debated about humanism
last time. We got bogged down a bit in some philology.
Nature versus function and humanism versus human interested. Anyway, whatever. We're not doing that.
Got our resident liberal scientist is gone, so that shouldn't be a problem.
But just as a way into this, I think what you just mentioned about like the news will not stop talking, and this is ideology, right? When news is talking about it, they will not stop talking about young men. And sometimes it's angry young men, but I keep track of the magazines and the opinion section of the New York Times. Every single one of them has an essay or essays about why would young men do this? Why are young men chauvinist? Why don't they care about women? Why are they sucked into the manosphere? Joe Rogan, man podcast, blah, 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 blah. So this is obviously ideology. And I want to suggest that it's even a humanist ideology because it assumes that like these broad systemic shifts, which are only explained by some high view sort of systems theory that can track these trends. No, instead they're saying individual men did this because they listened to Joe Rogan for too long.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on that qua ideology.
Me first or Eric first?
Well, actually, why don't we give you a chance? You weren't on the last episode. If you can just reflect on what do you get out of Althusser?
Concept of ideology.
Is he too Stalinist for you? Anything like that?
Not Stalinist enough, maybe.
Yeah, not Stalinist enough to be honest with you. Like, okay, so my take on Althusser's notion of ideology. So ideology as a relationship between material basis and the superstructures. Ideology emerges and at the same time reconstitutes material basis. But in a sense, ideology is there. And he mentioned it, I think, in chapter 4, that ideology, it's always the ruling class ideology. But not because the ruling class creates the ideology, but because ideology as a function of an autopoietic system has to perpetuate itself. Marx used to say, it's not the consciousness of man that determines his social being, it's his social being that determines his consciousness. Okay, so we have to think that ideology emerges out of a given set of real social conditions and relations. This produces ideology. But then ideology itself, as an explanation of a real condition in the world, also unconsciously produces a necessity to perpetuate and replicate the modes of production and the real modes of being in the world so that things don't really change. They just replicate itself.
Can I just ask you, this sounds like you agree completely with the reading, right? Or is there...
No, I'm just describing the reading of Althusser.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Does it make sense? It's it a proper reading of Althusser?
If I can even simplify it further, the crude Marxist way of describing this, and by the way, I don't really know any Marxists who describe it this way. It's that the economic stuff is real, and then the ideology stuff is fake. But as you just described, it's not real versus fake. It's more like cause versus effect. And then once you have the effect, which is the ideological system, then that can go on to cause other things. But you think of it not in terms of real and fake or true and false, but just the first thing happens and then the second thing happens.
Or, even like circular causality, like the A causes B, but then B itself is like a cause of A, or in that sort of circular causality domain.
Dialectical.
Dialectical. I mean, that's what systems theory and autopoiesis is basically like non-communist dialectics in a way, in the way that they sort of think that the effect is at the same time like a cause.
In a different point in time.
Yeah, and I sort of recognized a bit of systems theory in Althusser, because when he's describing ideology, especially, I mean, I cheated because I read that other, the ideology and the ideological state apparatus one.
And hey, don't worry, we're going to get to that next week in detail.
I know, but I think it's important to point out that his theory of the state and his theory of ideology too is not specific to capitalism. Like he wants, like, class society has existed since there's been an agricultural surplus that a small group of people have been able to control access to. And you have the emergence of hierarchies, and you have the emergence of class society. So you've always had kind of, his theory of the state goes way back beyond capitalism. And so does ideology, I think, too. And so I think he says this pretty explicitly, like he wants to give us this theory of the state, right? You have the sort of the state apparatuses on one side, and they divide into these two types of apparatuses, right? You have the repressive one that use direct force, like the police and the prison system and the judicial system. And then you have the ideological state apparatuses, the ones that work on your mind, right? The ones that reproduce that sort of ideology of the ruling class. So things like the family, education systems, media, those sorts of things, like any kind of communications institutions. Religion is an important one, obviously, as well. Those ideological state apparatuses. So I think any state has those mechanisms, right? A feudal state has repressive apparatuses and ideological ones. They're just much more concentrated around the church and religion on the one hand, and the king and his army on the other hand. And then in capital, you almost get this, like what Luhmann calls that functional differentiation. But in Althusser, it's more like you get all these different state apparatuses that take over the role of religion. So religion's not educating your kids anymore. That's a separate education system. The family unit changes, right, based on the different job and so on. So you kind of, to Pills's sort of question about ideology, I mean, you have to do a lot of work with Althusser to be like, okay, how does this specifically apply in the capitalist context? Like if the news, say, one of the ISAs, the ideological state apparatuses, is trumpeting this idea over and over that men have this or that problem. Why are men this way? Why are men that way? Right? You have to sort of specify the historical context that is occurring in, which is obviously things like we'd have to point at like the culture wars and the right-wing war against wokeism. Like it would take all fucking day.
We'd have to go even deeper than that. We'd have to go to like the notion that the man is the provider for the household. Like this is something that's they're not able to do, but they're responding to ideology by being upset. But again, the causes is just stagnant wages, and there's not good jobs.
Yeah, the causes of ideology are materiality.
Like gender in the family unit, for instance, is changing, and there's a certain ideological conflict that arises around that these news stories are a symptom of. Or there's a certain ideological conflict within the education system where it's like, do we teach Black history or do we just teach American triumphalism and ignore the rest of the world, right? And you get these kinds of, why are men so racist now? And there's reflections.
Or chauvinist. But then the chauvinist is like, okay, the real conditions here are there's women in the workforce. Why are the women in the workforce? Well, CNN will tell you it's because of feminism. Feminism allowed them to go pursue their own dreams. But that's also partially ideological because capitalism wanted them to get out of the house because they weren't making any surplus in the house. So get them out of the house.
And more laborers.
Put the kids in daycare. So yeah, if we pick at any single thread of this, I think this is exactly the right way to approach this. Because if you pick at any single thread of it, then you see this is connected to another aspect of, we might call it the signifying chain, and this points to another section of ideology, but there's no moralism here. That's what I, again, want to stress. It's not like it's good that women are working. It's not like it's bad that women are working. You don't judge that from a moral position. If you're Althusserian, you just say, this is part of the expression of something that Marx invents, which is called here the relations of production.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the reproduction of the conditions of production is one of the big. How does that get done? That's one.
Can you explain that?
Oh yeah. Oh my God. But yeah. How do the conditions of production, right? Producing the material conditions of where laborers go to work and produce things. And then you have the sort of relations of ownership, the relations of employer-employee, the relations of buyer and purchasers, whatever different hats people wear in relation to the conditions of production. That has to be reproduced from day to day, from generation to generation. It has to keep going, and it has to not break down. Just like a living organism in your autopoiesis example, a living organism has to reproduce its self-reproductive capacities from moment to moment. Its organs need to be maintained. It produces itself using its environment. It doesn't really interact with its environment, but it does use it in a way, but it uses it within its own self to reproduce itself. That's the autopoiesis analogy. But for Althusser, it's, how do those conditions of production, get, where's the continuity come from there? And it's the ideological state apparatus and how ideology works is ultimately where the answer is going to lie for him.
That's good. That's right. And I'm going to take another pass at simplifying it. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep everybody on the same page. But that's to say, here, people work, men work, women work, people also politic. And the people have power in any system, whether they realize that or not, or care or not, if only because there's a lot of people. But to reproduce the relations of production is pretty simply, can you get people to believe that the system is good and that it's working? So in that sense, ideology generates faith, and faith in the system is how the system continues on.
Yeah. So here's where I disagree with Althusser. In the manipulation of the ideological structures to change the material basis. And here's where I think Althusser is unfaithful even to himself, in the sense that Althusser thinks ideologically about the subject as a cause of transformation in the material basis. This is where I disagree with Althusser, because in a way he makes the critique that the concept of humanism is ideological because it's essentializing a contingent material condition that produced the concept of humanism. So normally the way it works is either anthropology, sociology, or psychology comes up with a definition of human nature, and then we use that supposed human nature to justify a political structure that reflects an essential or transcendental category of human behavior. What Marxism does is that, okay, if ideology, it's everything that we can describe about the world, it's all superstructures that emerge out of material conditions are ideological. Our concept of humanism is also ideological. So what would be a non-ideological concept of humanism? A dialectical material concept of humanism, like a process-driven, autopoietic thinking that the human itself is the adaptation to the material conditions that produce the consciousness of man. So even the ability of man to think about itself is contingent to whatever material conditions are the ones that produce consciousness under that specific time and frame. So it's not that Marxism is anti-humanist. I think what Marxism is anti-essentialist humanist. I don't know if I make any sense saying this.
Yeah, I don't know. The sort of essentialist humanism or anti-humanism is kind of like a false binary.
I agree.
Guess that there must be some middle ground there. And I think, the middle ground is probably, not this eternal essence of humans that is manifest in each individual human, either in principle or just entirely in each individual human. So you have this idealist notion of human nature, and then this empirical level where you can then examine individual human beings and sort of in an Aristotelian way build up to a general idea of what the human is, and then say, haha, it's always been that way. So, this essential or universal notion of humans. Yeah, it's historical to say, right? It's historical and it's materialist. It's based on the social relations, which are bound up with the conditions of production, right? And human nature can change in a sense. Yeah.
But I'm wondering how that. So you're calling for a way to reintroduce the human as something important, which is something that he's not letting you do. Is that the disagreement?
No, not that it's important, Pils. I think. No, it's not that I want to reintroduce humanism to as a critique to Althusser. Is that I think I think even I want to read the quote because just give me a second.
Well, let's look at the beginning of section 3, which is page 227 if you're following along, because this sounds mostly like it agrees with what you said. So then I was listening for the disagreement and I didn't catch it. So just to read the intro, there's 3 things that Marx did here that Althusser says, this breaks. 1845, it's the huge break. Humanism will never survive anymore, blah, blah, blah. In 1845, Marx broke radically with every theory that based history and politics on an essence of man. The unique rupture contained 3 indissociable elements, and those are defining humanism as an ideology, which is number 3, critique of the theoretical pretensions of philosophical humanism, which is his critique of previous economists mainly.
And Feuerbach, too.
And Feuerbach, exactly. And then the formation of a theory of history and politics based on new concepts. And those are all the Marxist concepts that we know.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, relative to what you just said, where do you take issue?
So I found the sentence, Pills. It says, so ideology, it's not an aberration or a contingent excrescence of history. It is a structure essential to the historical life of societies. Further, and this is important, only the existence and recognition of its necessity enables us to act on ideology and transform ideology into an instrument of deliberate action on history. Like this for me, according to me, this is incongruent because this again places subject as the cause of change of ideology and not as an effect in a causal change from materiality into ideology. It's on page 232 in the bottom.
Okay, just give me 1 second to read it.
Yeah, and to be fair, he does say, even though you can't break out of ideology, but you can be aware that you are a subject of ideology. And becoming aware that you are a subject of ideology doesn't really do anything except create an idea of ideology, right? An ideology of ideology. So it creates the second layer.
Yeah, but right? Because ideology is a cause of a mode of being in the world, given relationships of power and production and property, becoming aware of the ideological effect of those material conditions doesn't give you freedom to change ideologically. It's a where you live, where you work, what you eat, how much you have to work to survive.
Embodied in practice and in the ideological state apparatuses that you're a part of, which are material and practical as well. You go to school, you go to work, you watch the news.
You have to pay for shit. You have to ask for loans to survive. That's
the things you do. Yeah.
I wanted to come back to this quotation. You're objecting to the sentence specifically, only existence and the recognition of its necessity enable us to act on ideology and transform ideology into an instrument of deliberate action on history. And you are saying we cannot change it.
Yeah, I'm saying we are not autonomous to act on ideology.
Can you never change it?
Oh my God, I have no idea, man. Like, for example, at the moment, I'm studying neuroplasticity, and I'm studying how the brain changes given some actions in the world. Like for example, I was having this conversation in the morning with my therapist, which is a neuro doctor and also a psychoanalyst, and we were talking about the body image in the neocortex, right? So, and this is interesting because we can relate Lacan, Freud to Althusser, and the critique that Lacan made in Germany to the how do you say in English? La Escuela del Yo. There's a sub branch of psychoanalysis that is the school of the ego. It's where they say the ego is transcendental, that you are born with an ego, and where against Freud and Lacan was the first one to make this statement in Germany that he says no, that ego is contingent. You are not born with an ego. Ego is contingent. Okay, so even like for example, the mirror stage. It's a product of the 19th century. There was no mirror stage before. Like the idea of ego is contingent. Ego is not transcendental. Even in Latin America, a lot of like pre-colonial dialects, they didn't have an I in sentences. There was no I in language. when you met somebody new, the question was not who are you, is what tribe are you from? Like the I as a subject of language, it's a modern invention. Like, and this we can relate back to the 3 stages of the man of Marx as a communal identification, singular identification, and individual identification. And of course, the birth of subjectivity, it's also related to the material conditions that allow subjectivities to emerge. And in that sense, as subjectivity is the unreconcilable distance between the subject and the material reality, there is no post-ideological society. There's only new subjectivities to emerge out of new material conditions of relationships. That's why for me it's so weird to think about this sentence, because it's placing the subject as the cause of changing ideology. But then again, that subject, it's also a product of a previous material condition that produced that subjectivity.
That's a good point. But okay, I'll be honest. I don't think he's making the mistake that you think that he's making here, but he may be. But let's break it open a sec. You're objecting that he thinks ideology can be changed by will, basically, or deliberate action, conscious action. And if you deny that, you're somewhere in determinist territory, which I don't think you have a problem with, but just so we know, you're somewhere in determinism, and it's fine if you want to do that. But I don't think that he believes ideology, or all of it at least, is determinate. And I don't have like exact textual evidence either way for this claim, because he doesn't really say either way. But having read a couple of his texts in the last 2 weeks, I think he believes that there's a difference between like big ideologies and small ones, or I should say core ideologies, ones we don't even know that we believe, and then like peripheral or subcultural little systems. Do you know Inception?
Yeah. The levels of the dreams.
Yeah.
The dream within the dream.
Sorry to bring up Christopher Nolan again, but the real beliefs in Inception, I think it's a good analogy. The real beliefs are like the 4th level down or whatever, right? To get someone to change their behavior, you got to go 4 levels down. And ideology, it's always cultural to some extent, but I think on the deep inside are these notions that you can't do away with in your day-to-day life. Like you were mentioning tribes or whatever who don't have a singular first-person pronoun. They don't have the word I. Now, I think I can read all of Lacan and Luhmann and all the Buddhism I want, but growing up in my context, in our day and age, I don't think you can practically not believe that you are yourself and that yourself is your own property.
I agree.
I can imagine it could have been different. I can imagine that fact is constructed by language and by the mirror stage and all this shit. But I can't accept on the level of lived experience that I am anything but myself. Mm-hmm. And I doubt that anyone can convince themselves out of that, unless they're like schizophrenic, which is, they have an advantage. But I think we're all stuck in the self as an ideological concept. However, I don't think that all ideological concepts are like that. So I think that like some of them are easier to re-educate yourself out of, like people leaving a religion or growing up conservative and like becoming more liberal. Like it just seems to me like certain actors, either by influence or cultural capital or just regular capital, that individuals with influence can make ideological differences. And they're slow and they're over time, but it seems to me like that's reasonable. And I think Althusser agrees with that too. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been a politically active Marxist in the party his whole life. So, I don't know. Is it plausible that he could be referring to that in terms of putting his finger on the scale of ideology? That you can there can be influence, at least to the non-core ideological concepts.
So
I would suggest, I would only just suggest that the subject, like Althusser's sort of theory of subjectivity, isn't fully expressed in this reading as well. True. Like we would have to look at the ideological state apparatus readings, and specifically at the ideas of interpolation, subjectivity, and overdetermination in order to understand how subjectivity functions as a kind of product of ideology rather than something in which ideology inheres. Ideology doesn't so much inhere in a subject as subjects inhere in ideology. Like we swim in a sea of ideology. It's like the same thing. I always love this quote from Charles Peirce. He says something similar, like we shouldn't think that thought, just like we say, not that motion is in a body, but a body is in motion. We should say not that thought is in us, but that we are in thought. Yeah. And Althusser is saying something similar. Ideology isn't in the subject, right? The subject is in ideology. And the way ideology, specifically the apparatuses, recruit you is through interpolation. So that sort of weird analogy he gives you of like the hey there on the street comes from behind you and you just somehow know it's for you and you turn around and respond and you've been interpolated as a subject of that statement. He says, of course, this is purely fictional and there's no beginning, middle, and end to this. That's why I said it's a kind of circular causality. Yeah. Because the moment of hailing, the moment of interpolation, like seems like the cause, but already the subject is already sort of planted there. Exactly. In the ideology. And the ideology, that just kind of illustrates that you're in that ideology of the, hey, you there, and the cop is behind you, and then you're in trouble or something like that, right? You've parallel parked, you idiot, I'm going to give you a ticket or something like that, right?
True. I agree. Like the subject's in ideology, obviously, but it's also ideological to assign all action to subjects, even if that subject is ideology. Like conversely, you can assign aleatory action or non-purposive action, like accident and randomness. Like what I think you left out of the story is that the system calls to, but the call isn't what creates the subject. It's the turning around that creates the subject, acknowledging the other. So then what's doing the turning around? Like not all action is subjective.
We'd have to get more fully into his positive theory
of subject,
as opposed to what we're looking at now is more like his negative theory, like what he's moving away from. Like, for example, right, what Diego was just saying about ego psychology, that Lacan is very much bristling with hostility against in the Mirror Stage essay, like American ego psychology, specifically when Freud's followers went to America and established this silly like ego transfer theory, right?
Yeah.
Where so he's against that, but
which then became Dr. Oz.
So exactly.
Yeah.
That's ego essentialism.
Yeah. So I think in this essay for Althusser, what that would be a kind of what he describes here as the empiricism of the subject and the idealism of the essence, which can be an opposite as well. It can be flipped around. Empiricism of the concept and idealism of the subject. So you have this kind of transcendental ego that you're empirically investigating based on some kind of ideal notion of the way a person should be, like an idealism of the subject. Like, this is the perfect subject. Here's the subject on my couch. I'm going to empirically investigate their transcendental ego, and then I'm going to correct their their subjectivity, right? So you have that. This is what Marx is kind of moving away from, although, obviously psychoanalysis wasn't around during Marx's day, but, ideas about the unconscious were sort of floating around in the air.
I don't know. I gotta say, I think you guys are still reading this a bit too deterministically. Like we're just leaves floating down the river here. And then what's the point of him being a Marxist and going out to all his meetings? What's the point of sticking to the party when all your students are telling you to leave? To say there's no wholly inalienable self-contained subject is not to say that there's no me. It's just to say that what me is at an intersection of other systems. Like there's a bit of me in the TV. There's a bit of me in language that could have been a different one. It's diffuse, but it's not like ideology is the only social actor in society.
Yeah.
What would be cool here is to say that did he succeed in March of 68? Or what happened to the French Communist Party in March of 68?
Yeah.
Oops.
Well, Althusser was away doing something.
Yeah, I know, but they ended up pairing up with democratic socialists. You know, like it's insane because he starts this paper like quoting on the dangers of humanist socialists, right? And that's exactly what they conceded to in March of 68. Which is, but then again, it's not a critique, and I'm not trying to moralize what he's saying. Like, I think I agree with pretty much 99% of what he's saying in this essay. Like, it's very minimal, the detail that I'm disagreeing with. But you know this quote that what it's real is rational, but what is rational can be real, right? Because what it's real, it's rational in the sense that I think what happened in in May of 68 is what could happen, materially speaking. Okay, there was no ideological needle to be moved by Althusserian essays that were going to change the outcome of what happened in 68. And under that same sense, I think that the decision between becoming a Twitter Marxist or a Joe Rogan proto-reactionary, it's a fake choice. You know, it's you're already materially heterodetermined to become either one or the other. You just tell yourself the story to be more at ease with your position in the world. But then again, is it a matter of like I choose to agree with Joe Rogan or I choose to agree with Twitter Marxist 69? Like, I don't know, man.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're saying it's a function of your class position. Even though we want to imagine we're freely making these decisions to adhere to this or that set of ideas.
Are we?
Yeah, exactly. Are we?
It's better to believe that you are. Because
otherwise
you end up like him, and then you go into a hallucinatory state, a psychotic state, and kill your wife. Yeah. That's the outcome.
Yeah,
you kind of have to believe.
Yeah, the outcome of being not a materialist. What is the one word? Physicalist? The result of becoming a nihilist, a physicalist, nihilist, is that you can, you know, like it's not me stabbing my wife. It's just like
I've already strangled her. She's just now walking into
capitalism's just stabbed her.
Are you objecting to his inconsistency here and saying that we should embrace that inconsistency so that we don't end up having already strangled our wives?
No, I would just change one small thing in his assumption, is that our actions to change history is not on ideology, it's on material conditions. That's the only thing. If we reframe, because I wrote this on the side of the page, if we reframe the relationship between material basis and idealist superstructure from a political materialism point of view, is the relationship between bones and muscles. You know, so idealist superstructures is not in idealism. Like, ideas are material in the sense that they reflect a neurochemical process in the brain, in the sense that they are in the world, but they also are only understood and expressed in materiality. So in that sense, the only action of understanding ideology is to act on materiality, not on ideology. So I don't want to read Althusser to say I have to go on Twitter and fight with people and debate about the concept of Marxism. I want to read Althusser and say, okay, so I have to go and fight on public policy about the property of means of production. So then by changing property, I can change the material conditions that can potentially lead to the emergence of new ideologies and new subjectivities and a real change in history. That's my only change. Like, I'm not saying we should become nihilists that are overdetermined and we cannot do nothing. I'm just saying that once we are materially conditioned to be aware of ideology, we have to act on materiality, not on ideology.
Let's I think I agree with that.
Does it make sense, Pils? Did I respond to the question?
It does, but I think that he already includes, I read the quotation last week, if I'm not mistaken, and I can find it if necessary, but he does say that because ideology is an expression of the material conditions, it is indeterminate. That's why I brought up the example of if half of people are communists and half are fascists, then you know that there's a problem in the material conditions, because people are choosing wildly different examples from continuing what's already going, the status quo. So if people are looking very far afield from the status quo for something different from like what's happening currently, it's not determined which side they fall on, I don't think. I guess we could just disagree on that because I don't think he addresses it in this text. But I don't think that part is determined. I think what the ideology expresses is a problem, but you don't know what the expression is going to be. It's like when you hurt someone's ego, one person's going to cry and one person's going to get pissed. Like you don't know which is which. And I don't know.
You don't think, for example, on that specific response, okay, so how a person responds to trauma, don't you think that's materially conditioned as well? Like, for example, let's say you have a problem in your microbiome.
I'm not a physicalist like that at all. I would say that it's distributed on like a standard deviation, but I agree. I wouldn't say it's like physically determined.
But it's not ideologically determined. It's either co-determined or materially determined, but it's not ideologically determined. Or do you think our responses are ideologically determined and independent from materiality?
Wait, what are you talking about? Well, I don't think any event is ideologically determined. Only humanists believe that. I just also don't think that ideology is materially determined in the way you're describing. It's more like aleatory. Like, it'd be the same to me to say that language is materially determined, it would be impossible to test, impossible to prove, but even if it were true, it would be a meaningless claim. Because if language means what it means, then it's meaningful independent of causality. And if it means something other than what it means because it's caused by some physical factor, then stating in language that language means something other than what it means is meaningless. So in the same way that language doesn't have an outside, ideology doesn't have an outside. Like you can point to material conditions, quote unquote, but that's still an ideological concept.
What I like about what you said is that if we take that seriously, we can even say that Marxism is an ideology that is a product of the formation of capitalism as a mode of production. But Marxism or even dialectical materialism should be overcome once we reach a different set of material conditions that produce a new ideology. We're still reading Marx because the predominant mode of production is still capitalist. That's why capital is still relevant. But is it always going to be relevant? I don't think so. But I don't think what could be scientifical about Marx's method, it's the relationship between how materiality produces ideology. Just that. And we have to think that maybe even that it's a product of the time in which that was thought about. Because that was, in a way, Marx's big contribution to the history of sociology and anthropology.
I mean, what we get out of this reading is the main distinction between theoretical anti-humanism and practical, and the practical, right? The scientific and the ideological, the theoretical and the practical kind of. So when he says, one can and must speak openly of Marx's theoretical anti-humanism and see in this the absolute negative precondition of the positive knowledge of the human world itself and of its practical transformation. It is impossible to know anything about men, except on the precondition that the philosophical, theoretical myth of man is reduced to ashes. So any thought that appeals to Marx for any kind of restoration of a theoretical anthropology or humanism is no more than ashes, theoretically. But in practice, it could pile up a monument of pre-Marxist ideology that would weigh down on real history and threaten to lead it into blind alleys. So what he's saying here seems to be that promoting these pre-Marxist concepts of humanism could, quote, again, weigh down on real history and threaten to lead it into blind alleys. So if we're producing, if we're like, this seems clear in the context of his intervention against Marxist humanism and this reaction to de-Stalinization, is that he's saying going back to the early Marx and then making like cultural policies based on Marx's early humanism
or moral judgments.
Yeah, and morality and the essence of the human being,
Yeah.
and going back to this empirical idealism that is characteristic of both bourgeois humanism and pre-Marxist ideology. If we're going to go to that, it's like a compromising. It's like doing the same thing that Khrushchev is doing at the geopolitical level.
Yeah.
Is saying, okay, Stalinism is over. We're going to liberalize. We're going to, suppress the cult of personality. And he does that in the 50s, but then we still have this Stalinist terror for the next 30 years, 40 years. Even though Stalin's dead most of that time, we still have, like, it's a weird situation. Althusser is almost trying to steer this situation, but he's obviously limited, as I said earlier, because he's got to sort of disguise everything in this philosophical theoretical discourse. But his main point is like, give it up. Humanism is going to be on the stage as an ideology, but we have to be sure to exclude it from our theoretical apparatus and keep, I don't know, I don't like to say it, but keep the science almost purified of at least humanism in that sense.
Yeah, he says he's an anti-humanist, but the correct academic term for him today is post-humanist.
I think so as well. I think he's making a distinction between human and object.
Yeah, and especially in terms of object is what he calls structure, like the structure.
Exactly.
Althusser would have been big into systems theory, I think, if he had been aware of it.
I think on that
I think
front,
so as
yes.
well. I actually wrote that on the size of a page. Like that's why I went back to Autopoiesis and Maturata, because I think he will be. I think there's a lot of Heraclito in his argument.
There's a lot of what?
I agree.
Heraclitus.
Oh, Heraclitus, right?
Heraclitus,
yeah,
sorry.
the flux.
The same
guy.
letters, just different syllable emphasis.
Sorry,
Latin pronunciation.
Anglophone pronunciation of ancient Greek people who are
Heraclitus
of a language we don't know how it was actually pronounced.
My bet is on Spanish being closer to whatever the original was than ours is. But he does bounce between, what he calls the structure, and the structure is kind of the least developed part. He kind of refers to it, but as far as I know, I don't think he really fleshes it out. But you can see with his appropriation of like Lacanianism, ultimately, you don't know what's being structured. Like the unconscious is there, it's something, we have a designation for it, but it doesn't mean anything. And I think that's similar to what he means by the real. But his structuralism goes between an unconscious, but at a social level.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
It's not like there's anything actually being worked on, but the working on is what produces the object that you look back and then designate as these are the real conditions. So
I think I found it. It says, it's in this overdetermination of the real by the imaginary and of the imaginary by the real that ideology is active in principle. That reinforces or modifies the relationship between men and their conditions of existence. In the imaginary relation itself, it follows that this action can never be purely instrumental, that men who would use an ideology purely as a mean of action, as a tool, find that they have been caught by it, implicated by it, just when they are using it and believe in themselves to be absolute masters of it. Which is again, it's crazy, because he's saying that once you believe you are in control of ideology, you're already in ideology.
Yeah.
Right. But then that's why I thought that sentence, that the one that I quoted before, problematic, because he's also.
I see where you're coming from.
Yeah, there's no getting out of ideology in this way, but there is knowledge of ideology. And there's that famous quote, I think it's Engels, is that freedom is knowledge of the conditions of necessity.
No, that's Spinoza. Spinoza is freedom is the relative ignorance to the causes that condition you.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. So the best we can do Althusser is making this point too. Even he says it here, quote, Marx never believed that an ideology might be dissipated by a knowledge of it. For the knowledge of this ideology, as the knowledge of its conditions of possibility, of its structure, of its specific logic, and of its practical role within a given society, is simultaneously knowledge of the conditions of its necessity.
Exactly.
That's the point we get to, is knowledge of the conditions.
Contingency.
Yeah. The contingent material conditions that nevertheless provide the conditions of the necessity of this ideology that we're looking at. Right?
Like for example, there's another quote that I absolutely love that I'm going to use to criticize Javier Milei, the president of Argentina. He says, "This is the Rousseauian myth of the origin of inequality. The rich holding forth to the poor that is the most deliberate discourse ever conceived so as to persuade them to leave their slavery as their freedom."
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So it continues. Marx's theoretical anti-humanism does not suppress anything in the historical existence of humanism. So what Rousseau is talking about might really be the case, but again, it's a humanism wielded as an instrument of the ruling class.
Exactly. It's an ideology that is trying to perpetuate the material basis that produced that ideology.
There is no prior. It's like with Lacan, the unconscious appears with the conscious.
Exactly.
There's not an unconscious that becomes conscious. It emerges with a split. The gap is built in to the thing.
It's unreconcilable.
The environment emerges because of the distinction between,
If you had a mindless society, which we're on our way towards, but it would be only a mindless society that's fully outside of ideology, but it would also have nothing called material conditions because there would be no distinction to be made there. Like a society with no ideology is the Borg, basically.
Well, the notion of this is why, like, for example, I would like to mention this concept from Aristotle, simploque. Do you guys are familiar with the concept of simploque?
No.
So simploque is this Aristotelian notion that Aristotle said everything cannot be connected with everything, because if it was, it would be unnecessary for us to make conclusions because everything is connected to everything. And at the same time, nothing can be connected to nothing, or one thing can be independent from everything else, because conclusions or readings or interpretations will be unnecessary and irrelevant. So some things are connected to some things. So there has to be a source of like a categorical foreclosure to a theory of epistemology so that we can produce some higher degrees of truth, right?
Oh, yeah. This is that really old idea. If everything is the same as itself, nothing would happen. And if everything was different from itself, nothing would happen.
That's simploque, exactly. That's the notion of simploque. So simploque would lead us to a theory of epistemology and a theory of science as well. That is helpful to, because like you said before, so not everything can be overdetermined by capitalism as a mode of production, and everything can be explained by capitalist ideology. I agree. I agree. Like for example, I think even capitalist ideology as a product of the means of production, it's a part of how we explain reality, but it's not a totality. It's not a full encompassing description of our ability to perceive material reality. It's fragmented, like even in sciences as plural, like some sciences don't interact with other sciences. Some theories of philosophy don't interact with other theories of knowledge. Like what is strange is that even with Marxism, we have to be self-critic, and we cannot say that dialectical materialism explains everything, because that would be contrary to the simple notion of simploque. There's fields, there are categorical foreclosures within fields of epistemology that are self-containing. Some interact with some, like system theories. Some systems interact with some systems in some points, but not all systems are connected or over-determining of other systems. Otherwise, reality will be uncognizable.
Yeah, it would be a blooming, buzzing confusion in that case, permanently. I think one last thing to touch on, too, is because Althusser's... So we get to the point where we sort of agree. Okay, he says at the beginning of section 4, everything depends on the knowledge of the nature of humanism as an ideology. So it's not that humanism isn't real. It's not that ideology isn't real. But it's also not that, appearance is fake and then there's some reality that's more real than real behind the appearance, right? He's sort of cuts it there. He's saying, appearance is real. Like, even as Marx says, commodities might be the way I've described them, but there's still something real in your lives. You still go out, you buy things, you make choices, it influences your life. Like, these appearances have a reality in themselves. But anyway, what I was getting to is that Althusser's definition of ideology is something interesting in itself as well. And it is very influential and worth looking at. He says, an ideology, like he comes at it with a first definition, ideology is a system of representations, images, myths, ideas, or concepts, depending on the case, endowed with a historical existence and role within a given society. So again, there's that sort of, he's not just talking about capitalist social formations, he's talking about all social formations, that ideology is a system with existence in a given social formation.
Yeah.
And he says, okay, let's distinguish it from science quickly. Ideology is a system of representations distinguished from science in that it has this practico-social function, whereas science has a theoretical function. Function is knowledge. Ideology works on practice. Science works on, knowledge is a knowledge function. Right?
Can we make a parenthesis? Can we make a parenthesis on that definition of science? Because I think it's also another topic that was unconclusive on your last episode.
Do we want to go into? I can go into it if you want, because I read another paper that explains that.
Althusser's definition of science?
Yeah.
Yeah, please. What is Althusser's definition of science?
Okay, I'll get there. It is a little bit involved, and it comes from a different essay. And I have one other question to summarize this part that we've discussed that I don't get, and it's not answered in the text, so I need your takes.
Okay.
And it's based on what Eric just said when he says, like, you can have an ideology, which is this system, and it depends on the society. And then my question to that is, okay, how much of a society do you need? Can you have, like, an ideology within a group of friends or a town or a nation? Or because he only speaks of basically capitalism, global capitalism, and this kind of ideology. But I'm not sure from reading, I think 4 things from him now. I'm still not sure, like, how at how small a scale can something like ideology play out? Is it the same as?
So are you making the libertarian, the anarcho-capitalist example of you're alone in an island with a monkey and 2 bananas? How would you exchange the bananas with the 2 monkeys? Is this the type of?
Well, I think he comes from.
Does ideology function there
structural
too?
linguistics, so it would have to be at least at the level of language. But how small does it get? Because I was making fun of Peterson for saying gender ideology. Now, gender is an ideology.
Yeah, of course, it's ideological.
But is gender ideology in the way that he's saying it, where you believe there's like more than 2? Is that its own ideology? I'm not sure where you put the boundary about what can count as an ideology and what's just, I don't know, like the local rules of speech in a particular group.
I actually wrote next to this paragraph, communism is not woke. I swear to God.
Yeah, we've been over.
This paragraph, it's a better explanation of communism is not woke than we have ever read.
Yeah, this has given me a new take on this, obvious, because it's obvious to say that the rules of wokeness, they are ideological, and everyone knows this, especially the reactionary anti-woke people. But there are also the same types of rules to being anti-woke, which is a reaction. And now the question is, are these distinct ideologies one from another? And I think, no, it's clear. What I suspect is that woke and anti-woke are actually the same ideology. It's a double expression of the same speech code.
I think it is, because I've argued that wokeism is a kind of ruling class ideology. It is wielded as a disciplinary mechanism, first of all in like big corporations and universities to, you know, clean their image of any kind of wrongdoing on the gender front, just like having, you know, Indigenous and Black History Month and all that are sort of ruling class ideological maneuvers in a certain way.
So for me, an ontological separation between the subject and his materiality, it's liberalism. Or let's say an ontological independence from the subject to his materiality is a core value of liberalism.
Yeah.
So I still want an answer to my question. We've all read a bunch of Althusser. How small can an ideology be?
2 people.
Well, 2 people?
Yeah, well, I don't know, man. You have to at least have somebody to talk to. But then it comes to the question of who invented the concepts and the words that you're using to talk about this. So it's always already there.
Well, you need a mode of production, first of all, because that's something that needs to be reproduced. And that's part of the role of ideology, is to reproduce the relations of production, the social relations that pertain to producing material and social economic production, right? So you need a base.
So you need exchange.
And then you need a superstructure. So you need a political legal system, and you need, you know, these ideological apparatuses as well, like the church and whatever, the medieval.
So you're saying it needs to be huge.
Like you need to have a whole society.
More than 2. Yeah.
You need to have a hierarchically arranged class society. Yeah.
So at least 3. So I say 2, Eric says 3. How many pills?
Yeah, you need 3. God.
So you need one owner and 2 workers, and that's
yeah.
on a banana island.
You need a system of production, capitalist or not.
Hey, that means if you got 2 monkeys and they're working for the human, you got a society.
There's ideology. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then don't you think like if
some kind of relation of domination between them?
So Romulus, the founder of Rome, when he was being raised by wolves, he was non-ideological.
He killed Remus for ideological reasons.
I think Eric's onto something. I still think he's too big, but you do need a sense of interdependence, like human interdependence, but also a justification for that interdependence. So I would say you don't need an entire economy in the way that we would bracket what an economy means, but you need a system of exchange, interdependence, and then a justification for why things are.
I think it
would be like village size, I'd think.
Like that agricultural surplus. Yeah, you need like the emergence of cities and trade and things like that. You need classes, you need all these things. And these things all exist in non-capitalist circumstances, right? So you need kind of post-Neolithic society. Yeah.
Okay, that kind of answers my question.
I think so.
Somewhere
I mean,
there.
I got to go ask a Marxist archaeologist if there's ideology prior to Neolithic society. That might be a big discussion.
Yeah, but then can we confuse ideology with language?
Oh, definitely. And I think it happens. Yeah, I think in the post-Marxist paradigm that Althusser was very influential upon, yeah. I think, language and ideology do get equated. And I think that there's a question of whether that's useful or not. And Althusser doesn't help by using all those linguistic examples as for what interpolation is. Mm. But I don't know if he meant to make that conflation.
I think based on his descriptions of Lacan, you could, in principle, have a language without ideology, but we can't anymore. We'll never.
Yeah, we can't anymore.
Binary,
I agree.
Like zeros and ones.
Binary
language is the condition of ideology.
But no, we cannot go back. Yeah.
All right. So just because we had some discussion, I'll keep this as quick as possible, like under 5 minutes. We had some discussion in the Patreon about his views of science, and I thought I would update everybody because I found he wrote another essay. It's called Philosophy and the Spontaneous Philosophy of the Scientists. So this is written a little bit later, and he kind of goes back on some things he says. But just to say what his use of science is, it's kind of idiosyncratic, but more in common with what would have been said in like the early 20th century. So when we think of science strictly and we say something like hard science, this means going into a lab and changing colors of liquid and shit, right? So obviously we're not talking about that. We're speaking of science more in the sense of what we say, like a social science, or the soft sciences, I guess we'd say in English. So the soft sciences is basically what he says, but science is better or worse. There's better or worse sciences that are still sciences. So like Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, and they're just better or worse at using concepts to produce generic understandings of the real world. That's a quotation. So when he says generic, this means that they can be applied across disciplinary lines. So this is why this is one reason I said I think he'd like systems theory, because any system you can apply it. And then there are concepts, which means that there are going to be narratives about what's really happening. So for that reason, as soon as you have narratives, he says there's no such thing as science that is unmarked by ideology, which might be almost like what Latour might say.
Yeah.
Like anytime you're describing a story, you're telling human history, it always involves a narrative which always justifies the world as it is in some way. So that's as far as he goes. Basically, science in his mind is social science, and he never gets to what we would call the pure science. I don't know that he cares at all about that, or like whether math is ideological or representative or not. But mostly what he means when he says science is the same thing we say when we say political science, social science, maybe even psychology. It's just an explanation. And then you're going to have better or worse ones. And the better ones will apply more often. And the worst sciences are basic. They're based on your intuitions. So they're almost superstitions.
I have an interesting illustration of this too. So in the sort of historical background, right? When you all know Lysenko, right? When he came into prominence in the Soviet Union in what's called the Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau, he promoted a view of the two cultures, right? Before the famous, what was it, C.P. Snow's two cultures of the sciences and the humanities, Lysenko and the Soviet Union were promoting the two cultures of the sciences. You had the bourgeois sciences, and you have the the proletariat sciences.
And what's a bourgeois science, out of curiosity?
The bourgeois sciences were associated with post-Darwinism. They were accused of being ideological through and through, and just being a sort of social Darwinist imposition.
Do they mean like a Malthusian program or just Nazi stuff?
Well, mainly Lysenko attacked Mendelian inheritance. If you know anything about Gregor Mendel, the monk who kept, what was it, like pea plants?
Listen, I don't know how bourgeois it is for a monk to be doing pea experiments in his monastery garden. I swear to God, Marxists are just bored and want to fight anybody.
Talk about lacking enemies, eh?
Yeah, well, he noticed they had like white leaves and red leaves. And when he bred one of each plant, the leaves turned pink. And so he hypothesized that there are these factors involved in this process. This is what we call heredity. And those factors are eventually what we call genes once his work was rediscovered in the early 20th century. Lysenko attacked...
And this is bourgeois?
This is where genetics comes from. This is where the idea of biological determinism comes from, right? So Lysenko was very opposed to biological determinism. This is why Lysenko and Lysenkoism gets associated with oh my God, what the other guy from before Darwin, the neck stretch, the giraffe stretches its neck guy, Lamarckianism, right? Yeah, Lysenkoism, because he's an environmental determinist. So you have sort of this, I mean, this is kind of a cartoon of it, but you have this kind of bourgeois biological determinist science, and then you have this proletarian science influenced by Lysenko that's an environmental determinist science, saying you can change things about heredity mostly depends on environment and what we make of our material
epigenetical reading
reality.
of evolution.
Yeah, so our modern, concepts like epigenetics and non-genetic inheritance and cytoplasmic genes instead of nucleus genes and things like that. Those all get us, I mean, those are more accepted now thanks to people like Lynn Margulis and the symbiosis theory, the theory of symbiogenesis that she proposed, which she took from earlier Russian scientists and elaborated hugely. But anyway, that's the sort of debate. So there's these two sciences, right? The two cultures, kind of the communist version of the two cultures debate that Althusser is coming into. So and that's as far as my knowledge of that goes. I don't know how to connect it with what Althusser. I think he rejected that distinction though, and I think that this is where I'm not entirely sure what his position on that, I think, was that it needs to be abandoned.
Eric, is this just stage 2 of every Marxist, that you just become a Soviet lore master and everything has to be referred back to Soviet lore?
He already is.
Please,
I just appreciate. Well, I'm a big fan of Lynn Margulis.
In the name of the party, Eric, I would like to present to you with this medal that I brought from Moscow, and I will make it reach your destination as soon as I can. It's a pocket watch that you can remind yourself that we're all materially determined.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. So our enemies today are people like Richard Dawkins, who's a gene determinist, right? We're all just gene vehicles.
Non-dialectical reading of materiality.
Yeah, exactly. Like he's like the modern representative of what Lysenko would probably call this, bourgeois scientist.
And it's interesting that we're closing on this. There was a debate between two Spanish philosophers about a translation made by Althusser of Capital by Marx, where he implies a certain disconnection from Hegelianism in Marx. And it's according to one philosopher, it's a deliberate move that he's distancing himself. He's distancing Marx from Hegelianism by making a wrong translation of Capital from to Spanish. So the debate is highly technical, but it goes into this notion of the science produced knowledge. Just a recap of the argument is to say that no, science is not a model of the world. Science is not a copy of the world. Science is not an internalization of the world. Science, it's a mode of us using technology to interact with the world in a different way. So it's interesting in contrast with the definition of science from Althusser.
Yeah, not to take away from that, but what you described, this is currently like trendy critical theory. It's to say like science knows nothing, especially what it thinks it knows, but philosophy back here, we know what science is. So I'm not going to hop on board this trend. I'm going to just go with Althusser because I think of every discipline, the physical sciences are the least embarrassed to admit what they fail to explain. So I just find them trustworthy for that reason alone.
Yeah.
And then if a Marxist comes along and says, well, this is merely a windowed interaction with the world.
I just want to prove I can speak academic Spanish. Was one of the things they were arguing about was that there was a certain, you said like the translation issue. So I think the Spanish version of Capital was translated from the French.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And there was a passage that was left out on Hegel, like that was consciously sort of cut out there.
Exactly.
And they were almost like making a play on words with like Althusser's epistemological break and like the cutting out of that passage from the translation in order to sort of further distance Marx from Hegel. But like, yeah, because Althusser's sort of argument is that like Marx was never a Hegelian. Even by the 40s, he was already like
post-Hegelian, which I agree with this Spanish philosopher. Marx was not, he never abandoned Hegel. I think really Marxism, it's a Hegelian dialectical overcoming of idealist Hegel, if we can say that.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't agree then with the part because Althusser says that dialectical materialism is ideology, as opposed to historical materialism, which is what he says Marx is doing in Capital Post.
That's the science of history versus like the worldview philosophy. Yeah, dialectical materialism, the worldview, the philosophical worldview.
Is dialectical at the level of real or at the level of symbolic?
Are you asking me? You know what I'm going to say. The dialectic is imaginary. It's one of the best examples of reducing complexity to intuition that I can think of.
At the imaginary level, really?
Yeah, I think Althusser would agree with me too. This is like post hoc rationalization. Dialectics is ideological.
I
think dialectical is at the level of symbolic.
Now, there's a material dialectics between the forces of production and the relations of production, which comes out, which gets externalized as class struggle.
It's cool that each of us can argue for a different level. Like Eric is a true Soviet. He's saying dialectical is at the level of the real. Fields is a post-structuralist. He's saying dialectical is at the level of the imaginary. And I'm being a nihilist. I'm saying dialectical is at the level of symbolic.
Well, it sounds like we have to do an episode on this then. I'm confident.
But the concept of dialectics is symbolic.
I mean, it would be if it worked, if it was like reproducible, but only like Marxists for 80 years have proposed it, and it's never worked. This is the definition of science: is can you apply it?
We're talking about it.
I must say I am kind of sympathetic to Michael Heinrich's arguments, though, that like when Marx uses that line that I think was cut out of the Spanish version, that he's like coquetting with Hegelian forms. What it's a mode of presentation. It's not a method. Marx will never say that there's any kind of dialectical method that produces these results, that he was presenting the categories dialectically in order to show you how one sort of grows out of the other. We got to start with the commodity, with the internal dialectic, and then how that gets externalized and exchanged, et cetera, et cetera.
Freedom gets negated.
Yeah, so he's presenting it dialectically, but he's not using dialectics as a kind of rough and ready method to produce any results. He's still reading fucking boring ass parliamentary reports and bourgeois ass economists doing their bourgeois ass things. Yeah, he's reading those people. He's not like applying a dialectical method to them. He's trusting their empiricism, and then he's just criticizing, well, they're just empiricists in this. They're structural empiricists. They're not like presenting their ideas dialectically.
Representing. Dialectics is useful at a level of representation.
If they did, they'd probably still be wrong anyway. Yeah, but
it has to. That discussion leads into the definition of science, which is much more interesting. I think they use that argument of the mistranslation and the misintention of Althusser to separate Marx from Hegel, but they use that to talk about the let's say the mistake in the conception of science in Althusser, because
I mean, I totally agree with that it doesn't produce knowledge. But then I would have said this produces a representation. But if they're saying that he's saying that you're just describing a representation, so there's almost no point to it at all.
Yeah, they're being more radical. Yeah.
Well, here's Althusser's final statements on this we can get out of this paper. Is he's going to say even a communist society couldn't do without ideology. And this is a good line. Human societies secrete ideology as the very element and atmosphere indispensable to their historical respiration and life. Only an ideological world outlook could have imagined societies without ideology and accepted the utopian idea of a world in which ideology, not just one of its historical forms, would disappear without a trace to be replaced by science. So it's only when you're the deepest within ideology, or only when you have ideology, is it possible to imagine a world without it, right? And that's contingent upon us becoming aware that we are subjects of ideology. And then we can imagine these utopias from within that. And then you get into the roles of things like artists and literature in that as well, imagining something different. Even if you can never really escape the bounds with some imaginative leap into some other society, even science fiction and fantasy writers have to be sort of very attuned to the real relations that they're writing in and from. But that imaginative leap.
Well, then you have to take back that you said dialectics belong to the real. You just contradicted yourself.
Did I?
And also, Diego, you'll
have to show me that. You'll have to show me that.
Identity is the main feature of what dialectics categorizes.
We can have that discussion. Dialectics, I still believe, is at the level of symbolic because, as you said, it needs a subject separation in order to be used as a concept that is interpeeled by other. So it's already beyond imaginary. It's already a second metaphor.
You could be right but I don't know, because I think dialectics functions in historical materialism, which is the name of the science that Althusser and many others give to Marx, right? Marx's discovery, and dialectics functions in it just outside of its shell, right? What's that famous line, peeling it out of the mystical shell that Hegel delivered it to us in, whatever that is. So dialectics is, I don't want to, it's got to be ideological still, but it's in a way.
So season 17 of the Peel Pod is going to be back to Hegel?
No.
Yeah.
No.
All right.
This is what I appealed
Phenomenology
already.
of Spirit, page 1.
Anti-dialectically, I appealed to randomness as an essential element of the universe. But
better.
Insofar as we're associating like ideology with language is also an expression of something else. We don't know what else, just prior to language, non-linguistic. But it emerges differently everywhere that it happens. So it's still... There's like an element of randomness, I would argue,
there is.
Not determined, not dialectical to the evolution of these things. Anyway,
so God doesn't play with dices.
Well, when we use language too, we're using it consciously to express things, and that's when ideology asserts itself like unconsciously through structures.
Wait, language is conscious now? Whoa.
Well, when we
give us another hour.
Whoa. What do you mean when we use what do you mean when we use? Well, you have to separate. Ideology is not in consciousness. It actually says profoundly unconscious, even when it presents itself in a reflected form, unquote. And then I would say a reflected form could be language or some other system of representation, right? But it asserts itself unconsciously.
All right. It's because language is profoundly unconscious that I know you didn't mean what you just said, which is why we can close down this exchange. And yeah, we didn't make it far through the reading last time. I got your complaints, but I think that's been rectified at this point.
Take that. You're complaining that we're in the weeds.
Yeah, take that. Yeah.
No?
We went into the mistranslation of the capital from French to Spanish to find the implications on the definition of science from Althusser. If that's not careful reading, there's no such thing as careful reading.
Yeah, I think we touched bottom. I think we touched bottom.
Let us pull our gum boots out of the river and see if we can get out of these weeds for a second. All right.
I think
but
I'll
next
stay
week,
a while.
Don't worry, we're not done. Next week we're going to do more ideology, and that's it from
We
us. We're going to read. I wanted to read the actual ideology essay.
Yeah, the ISA.
Let's go there. Yeah.
ISA. All right, never mind. Let's do it.
All right. Thanks, guys. Talk to you later.
Adios.